2015 was a pretty good year for games. It's the year that I remember most fondly for AAA games such as Fallout 4 and Metal Gear Solid. If you're thinking to yourself, that's it? What about The Witcher 3, Dying Light, or Batman? You see, due to my finances at the time, I could only play a small number of titles. Couple that with my low specs, it greatly limited the games I could play. The remainder of my money was spent on indie games, and as it so happens, Undertale and Ori and the Blind Forest were released in 2015, both of which are fantastic, but only one can be the topic of today's video. First impressions are everything, and Ori manages to meet and exceed them with beautiful visuals, a musical score by Gareth Coker, and polished gameplay. That is, at least how I last remembered it. It's been 4 years since I last played it, and opinions can differ over time. Even though its definitive edition was released, I never really had time to revisit it. Now that I'm on break, I have no excuses. So without further ado, let's get into it. Ori and the Blind Forest was developed by Moon Studios, a developer who at the time had no resume to speak of. They were a new studio, an indie studio, but one where its members had experience in game development, with some having previously worked for Blizzard and Animation Lab. What sets Moon Studios apart from a typical developer was that its members are spread across the globe. Knowing that the idea of migrating to a single location to form a studio was unfeasible for such a small team, they decided an online environment was the best option, and its members wouldn't see each other in person until E3 2014, when Ori and the Blind Forest was first announced. Before the game was even conceived, the team worked on a first-person shooter called Warsuit. It was this prototype that got the attention of several publishers, most notably Microsoft. But it wasn't the demo that impressed the publisher, it was the team's capabilities. As for Warsuit, Microsoft suggested the team work on another project, as online first-person shooters were already a saturated market. This advice surprised Thomas Mahler, the game's director, but he understood where they were coming from. Moon Studios went back to the drawing board, and what resulted was Sign, a metroidvania where you control a forest spirit. The definitive edition comes with videos of this prototype, demonstrating the early stages of gameplay, art direction, and level design. It was this demo that got Microsoft's attention, and they agreed to fund the project to completion. What was once a half-year pursuit turned into a 4-year development cycle. With a new vision and a new goal in mind, Moon Studios had their work cut out for them. What we got was the final product, released on the 11th of March 2015, with its definitive edition releasing a year later, with new areas, abilities, and fast travel, reducing the tedium of backtracking and improving the game's pacing. As a Metroidvania, Ori is fairly linear compared to Hollow Knight, a game I played earlier this year. Linearity is not a bad thing, but it does diminish the game's already low replayability, with the only side content being the hidden collectibles found all across the world. With the player's progress being railroaded, it allows the developer to design levels based on what abilities Ori will have, not what they can have. What results is level design that feels organic, with natural progression in the ways challenges are presented to you, starting with a simple concept, using wall jumps to climb, and iterating on it, using wall jumps to move between platforms. This progression is most prominent in the game's early areas, with the late game assuming you have mastery of Ori's moveset. The main goal of the game is to restore the elements of water, wind, and warmth in the Ginso Tree, Forlorn Ruins, and Mount Horu. Each dungeon requires their respective seals to open, which in total means there are 6 main areas to explore, with the addition of 2 more in the definitive edition. The order in which each element is restored will always be the same. After all, you can't reach the Forlorn Ruins without completing the Ginso Tree because you lack the abilities to get there, and you can't complete Mount Horu without restoring the Forlorn Ruins. At least, not without exploits. I believe this was a missed opportunity to allow the player to complete each dungeon in any order, giving the player more freedom and adding to the game's replayability. It's understandable why Moon Studios chose to go this route, as it would essentially mean the entire map would need to be redesigned. Completing each area will require a combination of running, jumping, and combat. Ori feels fast, responsive, and fluid, with great animation giving them a sense of elegance and grace with every step and leap. The weak link here is the combat. How do I put this? The combat is not very good. The blue orb that follows you, called Sign, automatically targets enemies with their spirit flame. Enemy encounters at the beginning of the game can be boiled down to mindless and rigorous tapping of the X button, and by the time you unlock new abilities such as Charge Flame and Ground Pound, it trivializes almost every encounter due to their spammable nature. What this means is that most enemies can be dealt with in the same way. See that blob? Ground pound it. See that frog? Ground pound it. See that rhino? Pound that ground. It's very clear that combat was not a focus for Moon Studios, and the lack of enemy variety only supports this. Instead, where Ori shines is its platforming. As you progress, you will unlock new abilities. Ori hands out these abilities like candy, so much so that I wouldn't blame you for thinking it was Halloween all over again. Out of Ori's arsenal of skills, the Bash ability is a clear standout, essentially turning every lamp, enemy, and most projectiles into a platform to leap from, giving Ori mobility and versatility that isn't found in many Metroidvanias I've played. Having this fast sense of progression feels great. Wanna know what doesn't feel great? Not being able to rebind controls, which seems like a strange decision considering that the game has 11 abilities, 2 of which are exclusive to the Definitive Edition. That's a lot of abilities. What results is your fingers often get tangled during the late end of the game, as you try to remember which button does what. Technically, on PC, you can rebind the controls using a text file located in the game's local app data, but that should have been built into the menu, not hidden in a file. During your time in the Forest of Nibble, you are bound to come across many challenges. Live, die, repeat is a cycle we are all too familiar with, and in games that have you backtrack long sections after each death is a test in persistence, patience, and frustration. Ori's answer to this are the soul links, allowing you to save your progress virtually anywhere at the expense of an energy cell. Soul links are a great, intuitive, and innovative mechanic, and it's something I'll miss in games that don't have a similar system. Being able to save your progress without having to backtrack after each death is liberating, especially after playing tougher games like Hollow Knight. The downside is that it doesn't save any progress after its creation. Creating a soul link before an arena and dying afterward will have you repeat the entire section again. I believe this was a conscious decision made by Moon Studios to encourage the player to be more conservative with their soul links. After all, saving your progress is no longer controlled by the developer through purposefully placed save points, with minor exceptions. Instead, that responsibility falls onto the player. If the levels preceding each dungeon are to familiarize the player with their abilities, the dungeons themselves would be a good opportunity to test them. This is true for the Ginso Tree and Mount Horu, both of which are appropriate challenges for the player's skills and making use of Ori's available moveset. The Black Sheep is the Forlorn Ruins. You see, every area in the game has a mechanical gimmick of some kind. The Ginso Tree had portals, and the gimmick of Mount Horu was that there was none. These gimmicks serve as a way to spice up level design, to make each level feel distinct and unique in gameplay. The Forlorn Ruins centers around the manipulation of gravity, where the gravitational pull is relative to the floor Ori is standing on. The very concept itself is brimming with potential. If gravity is relative, it allows the opportunity to approach levels at multiple angles. The execution, however, leaves something to be desired. You see, to manipulate gravity, you'll have to carry this orb. Doing so not only makes you slower, but it limits the abilities you can use. The argument could be made that it's possible to complete most of the dungeon without the orb by using the skills acquired up to this point. But the thing is, the gravity mechanic is what determines the level design. Most puzzles can only be solved through this particular mechanic, with some sections further incentivizing it as the hot surfaces found throughout the ruins can only be cooled down by staying within the orb's energy field. What we're left with is a surprisingly short dungeon with an interesting but underutilized mechanic, which could have been placed earlier than the Ginso Tree given the few abilities required to complete it. What all 3 dungeons have in common are the escape sequences, which serve as a substitute for boss fights. Instead of testing your combat capabilities, they test your platforming skills. For some, they are the highlights of every dungeon for their tense and adrenaline-pumping nature, backed by a fantastic musical score, whereas others despise them, as they present a difficulty spike which, in some part, is due to their reliance on trial and error. I tend to swing towards the latter, but I would argue that the Ginso tree is the exception out of the three, which clearly communicates the direction for the player to go and telegraphs each section appropriately. Trial and error isn't needed, only mastery of Ori's bash ability. The same can't be said for the Forlorn Ruins, which requires multiple attempts because the game directs the player upwards before rocks are scripted to fall over. This happens 2 times. Couple that with RNG spikes and it doesn't make for an enjoyable experience. The problem is that it doesn't test the player's skills, only their willingness to be persistent. My feelings towards the Forlorn Ruins are mixed, and it's the part I look forward to the least on my playthroughs. But there is an alternative. Using a combination of AI manipulation, investing in the right skill tree, and using Ori's abilities, both the Forlorn Ruins and the Misty Woods can be skipped in their entirety. Which leads me into the skill tree, and the new abilities for that matter. Apart from exploration, Ori has light RPG elements in the form of a skill tree. Every skill requires ability points, obtained either through level ups or ability cells. Each tree focuses on a different aspect of Ori's playstyle. The combat tree is the most straightforward, increasing both the damage or rate of fire of Spirit and Charged Flame. It doesn't improve the way you approach combat in any meaningful manner, but the ability to make it less tedious is appreciated. The efficiency tree improves the effectiveness of most pickups, with subsequent upgrades focusing on highlighting icons across the map. This tree is the one I find myself investing in the least on repeat playthroughs. The reason being is that I can't find myself having to justify spending points to highlight more map icons, especially when I can get that for free by pausing and going to the Nibble interactive map. It's an interesting dilemma for any developer. Does the existence of outside guides justify the skill's place in the game? I'll let you decide on that one. Last but not least is the utility tree, which is perhaps the most interesting out of the three, increasing Ori's survival and defense capabilities. And utility is the operative word, allowing soul links to both restore health and be reused. The highlights in this tree are air dash and triple jump. Apart from being absolutely incredible, they synergize well with each other, Kuro's Feather and Bash, allowing you to close ridiculously large gaps. The problem with triple jump, like dash and light burst, is that it's optional, meaning levels had to be designed without these abilities, allowing levels to be completed in ways that weren't intended. The sequence break showed earlier was one such example. Another one would be this particular stealth sequence. The proper way to go through this sequence is to quickly move between different hiding spots. But since you can bash off of light bursts, you can effectively skip 2/3 of this section. These skips are clearly not intended, but I'm okay with it since they don't break the game and rewards the player for thinking outside the box. So with that out of the way, we can finally talk about the Sorrow Pass. The Sorrow Pass gets a special mention for its abundance of spikes, making the damage scaling more apparent. Ori's obsession with spikes is reminiscent of the buzzsaws in Meat Boy or the White Palace in Hollow Knight. As it turns out, Meat Boy was one of the game's inspirations, seemingly confirmed by his cameo. Ori is a tough game, partly because some sections require careful navigation or quick thinking. On the other hand, the game scales the damage of later areas, presumably to account for the player's growing health pool. The difficulty is increased, but what's lost is consistency. I believe a similar system found in series like Zelda or Hollow Knight can be substituted. In both games, the player must acquire 4 health fragments to increase their overall life. This system limits the player's health pool, provides a sense of progression and reduces the need for excessive damage scaling. Alternatively, the Definitive Edition allows you to change the difficulty to either increase or decrease damage all across the board. Tweaking difficulty in games that are meant to be challenging is often a controversial topic, with some players expressing contempt for those who use cheats or other methods to make the game easier. Having more options is never a negative, and the ability to choose the difficulty is a positive. At the end of the day, Ori and the Blind Forest doesn't break the mold of the Metroidvania formula. What it lacks is originality, but it makes up for it in how excellent it plays from the level design and the versatility of Ori's moveset. For players, veteran or new to the genre, there's a lot to enjoy and discover, with negatives few and far between. For returning players, they might find there's little reason to revisit it due to the game's minimal side content, and the new areas, while a neat addition, aren't much to write home about. For how much praise Ori gets for its gameplay, one has to wonder if the same can be said for its story. One of Ori's biggest strengths is its presentation, with a strong introduction that immediately showcases its stunning visuals, marvelous animation, and a soundtrack which can only be described as magical. Ori and the Blind Forest tells the story of an orphan who was swept away in a violent storm and taken into care by their adoptive mother. Their relationship is what forms the emotional core of the narrative, showing us their happiest moments together in tandem with Gareth Coker's musical score, which perfectly sets the mood with what's presented. Ori's introduction of a foster parent and their child is not an original concept, but like Kirby Ferguson once said, nothing is original and everything is a remix. Creative works are almost always derivative, and what makes one stand out from the crowd is execution. The introduction succeeds because it manages to build a heartwarming and endearing relationship between Ori and their mother before the gut punch that is Naru's death. It's the combination of character interaction, great animation, and music which sells every moment. Some may say it's cliché, but I'd say it was worth it, especially given the climax. Despite the opening's heavy emphasis on storytelling, Ori is very light on narrative, with story beats delivered through dialogue, cutscenes, or visual storytelling. Ori has an expansive world, filled with magic, strange creatures, and giant talking trees. In short, it's a fantasy. Fantasy is one of my favorite genres. After all, I wouldn't be playing The Elder Scrolls if it didn't have the lusty Argonian maid. It's strange then that I wasn't invested in the game's setting, the Forest of Nibble. While most areas are beautifully rendered and realized, it leaves little room for the player's curiosity. Apart from the forlorn ruins, what can you tell me about the Ginso Tree, the Sorrow Pass, or Mount Horu for that matter? What about these areas makes them unique and interesting? Sign and the Spirit Tree do have dialogue to provide context to the world, but these moments are too few. Where Ori lacks in creativity for its locations, more focus was placed on its characters. What connects each character together and is a major theme in the story is family, and it's ultimately what causes the domino effect leading to the forest's decay. In the world of Ori exist creatures of light and darkness. Being designated as one or the other doesn't determine one's morality, but in nature, they are incompatible, with the spirit tree's light having the ability to hurt or kill dark creatures. It's shown multiple times that both can coexist, with the Gumon using light to power their technology, and Naru, even as a child, was unafraid and empathetic towards the tree's spirit guardians. Other creatures weren't as fortunate, as shown in the cutscene where Kuro's children were killed during the spirit tree's light ceremony. It was this moment that made Kuro resent the light, ripping sign from the tree itself, causing the forest to decay, the near extinction of the Gumon, and the deaths of many spirit guardians. Without this cutscene, it would have made Kuro's heel turn at the end unbelievable, as Naru's affection for Ori brings Kuro to her senses, realizing her actions nearly resulted in the death of her last child and the destruction of the forest. Making the ultimate sacrifice, she restores the forest at the cost of her own life. The story, while simple, is effective, and never overstays its welcome. My only problem is how it handles death. What makes death a powerful concept is its permanence, and every time a character dies, it reminds us of our mortality. You may have noticed that despite me telling you that Naru died in the opening, she is suddenly still alive. It turns out, Gumo used the light from the spirit orb in the fallen ruins to revive Naru, like how the tree used its last remaining power to revive Ori. In a way, it reminds me of those TV shows, or even other games that feature the death of its main characters, only to reveal that they A. never died, or B. were brought back to life. Not only does it lessen the stakes, but the initial emotional impact is weaker for subsequent viewings. Perhaps the writer wanted to end the story on a less depressing note, because while the forest is restored, it doesn't undo the near extinction of the Gumon, or the deaths of Kuro and the spirit guardians. When you take that all into account, it's a bittersweet ending, and it would have been more bitter if Naru remained dead. With her alive, Gumo now has a place to belong, and Kuro's child has a brighter hope for the future. Revisiting Ori and the Blind Forest 4 years later has been a particularly interesting experience. Ori has always been a game I've adored, and perhaps, due to nostalgia, I only remembered its best moments, and not its faults. Looking at it critically has made me understand why certain things work well, and why it doesn't. Platforming is as good as I remember, with varied environments, challenges, and collectibles that organically build upon the player's skills. But questionable level design at certain sections creates an uneven difficulty curve that seemingly only serves to frustrate the player. Player progression and exploration is linear, but it would be interesting to see how a future game could play with a more open-ended design. The combat is easily the game's weakest aspect, with attacks feeling unsatisfying as a mechanic and in execution. All signs point toward combat being an afterthought, something that was possibly conceived late in development and couldn't be expanded upon due to deadlines. For all its faults, I still love it. Everything Ori does well, it manages to excel in. Satisfying skills, astonishing art, and mesmerizing music makes Ori a joy to play, see, and listen to. With the game's success, a sequel is inevitable, and with it comes new challenges, new worlds, and new stories to tell.